So as you might be thinking, setting up development environment for Hadoop can be quite complicated. I found the best way to approach it is to break it down into steps. So let's do that here. The first part is you need to figure out how you want the Hadoop binaries to be accessible. So you have really a couple different considerations. The first thing is, do you want to work with the open source, plain vanilla Apache Hadoop binaries, or do you want to work with a vendor distribution? And usually we'll work with a free version or developer edition. And the way you pick the vendor is, if you have a preference because you have worked with that vendor before, say Microsoft, or you think the vendor is leading in the market, as Cloudera is said to be by many analysts and consumers at this time, or there's a feature that the vendor has that you want to use. So you need to figure out which version of Hadoop you want. Once you figure out which vendor version you get, then you want to figure out which version number you want. And usually you want the latest stable release, which is 2.4 as of the date of this recording, but it does change very rapidly, so you should check the Apache Hadoop site that I showed in an earlier recording to see what is the latest version, what's going to work for you. And probably the most complicated part of this is to figure out which location you want to put your Hadoop cluster or server in for development. I've found that it's often faster and in some ways cheaper to spin up a Hadoop server or a Hadoop cluster on the cloud, because as I showed in the previous movies, it's just a couple clicks once you understand all the different options. And I have tried to do a local install a couple times, but I really ran out of time. It took more than a day the first time I tried to do it. So even though it's completely free to install the Hadoop binaries on a Linux box, it really is complicated, especially if you're coming like I was out of the Windows ecosystem, and time is money. One thing I will tell you, if you do decide to go with a cloud-based version of Hadoop, is the cloud vendors do charge you. Amazon charges by the minute. It's really a common new developer mistake to forget to turn off a cloud instance, and you can run up a lot of charges. So you really want to make sure that you turn it off when you're done. In the middle here is the option that I most often use, which is I will get a local virtual machine because I don't run a Linux box natively. Unless I used Hortonworks, I would have to, which runs on Windows, I would have to have a Linux box for it. And I will usually use the Cloudera virtual machine on my laptop. In order to do that, I have to have virtualization software. So I'm going to show you the steps to set that edition up with a local virtual machine in a subsequent movie. Now there are a couple more considerations on your development environment for Hadoop itself. The data storage. I find that when you're first starting, it's actually simplest if you just set up Hadoop as a single distribution, which uses the native file system, which might seem kind of like you're wimping out, you're not using HDFS, but as you'll see when we get into it, writing the MapReduce algorithms is pretty complicated, much less testing that code and debugging it and deploying it onto production. So when you're just starting, it's good to start with, I think, the simplest possible situation. Now, quickly, you're probably going to move to the pseudo-distributed model, which is a single HDFS file system on a single machine. I find that I very seldom use a full distributed implementation for writing sample code or proof of concept code. That, of course, I will do if I'm in a production situation, but I find that when I just get started, to set up a cluster of either virtual machines or a cluster of Linux boxes is kind of overkill for development. The other situation is, if you are using the cloud, then you need to figure out if you're going to use HDFS in, let's say, Amazon EMR, Elastic MapReduce, or if you want to just use S3 in the case of Amazon, or in the case of Azure, if you just want to use blobs. And again, just like using the local file system when you are developing on a local machine rather than HDFS, I do find that sometimes when I'm using a cloud-based distribution, I'd rather just use the cloud-based file system. So kind of a learning I've gotten over time in working with Hadoop that when you are in development, you don't always need to use the HDFS file system. The third consideration is which libraries do you want to have as part of your installation? Which of the features are you going to be writing code against? So the core is which version of MapReduce, 1.0 or 2.0. And because there's so much richness around MapReduce, I'm actually going to show both in this course. We're going to start with 1.0 and then we're going to move to 2.0 when we're writing our MapReduce jobs. You also want to consider which additional libraries. As you've seen in previous movies, it's most common to have Hive or Pig at minimum. There are a number of other libraries that modern developers will use, and we'll touch on those as we get into that as well. And then finally, you're going to need some developer tools. So we're going to talk about that in the next movie. going to use in this course to work with Hadoop is the Cloudera Hadoop Sample Virtual Machine. There are a couple considerations here. In order to work with this, you need to look at your operating system and get the appropriate virtualization software. Sometimes the virtualization software costs money, sometimes it's free. I'll be using a Windows machine with VirtualBox. I've already downloaded the VirtualBox software in preparation for setting up my VM. The next thing is I'm going to get the Hadoop virtual machine from Cloudera for Windows for VirtualBox, and I'll show you what that looks like or where you get it from in just a second. That machine will include Cloudera tools and samples. It's a developer edition. What I'll be working with is the Enterprise edition, but for development. So it's important to understand that if you were to deploy that, you would have to pay Cloudera a fee for some of the tools that are included with the sample that you're working with. And then in a later movie, I'll be showing you how to install additional developer tools that I find useful to work with. Now let's take a look at the Cloudera site so you can understand where to download the virtual machine. Here I am in the Cloudera site, and I'm going to be working with their Quick Start VM. So you notice the VMs run CentOS 6.2, and they're available for these types of virtualization software: VMware, VirtualBox, and KVM. You'll also notice that all of these VMs require a 64-bit host OS. Now, if I click on the version dropdown, I do have access to older versions, and these map to older versions of the Hadoop binaries. But we're going to work with the latest and greatest thing here. Again, I just happen to be most familiar with Cloudera's distribution. You could use MapR, or you could use Hortonworks, or one of the other ones as well. This is just the one that I've used most oftenly. Now to get it, I'm going to scroll down, and you can see that I download from here, and I downloaded the one for VirtualBox.